Tiana Washington awoke that morning feeling a mixture of excitement and pride. She couldn't wait to show off her new braids at school, the ones she and her mother had spent hours perfecting over the weekend. Each braid was meticulously woven and accessorized with a few golden beads that caught the light just right, adding a subtle shine to her thick, dark hair. For Tiana, her braids weren't just a hairstyle. They were a piece of her identity, a tangible reminder of her culture, her family, and the connection she felt to her ancestors. She had carefully chosen this style, feeling that it reflected her personality: bold, bright, unapologetic. As she admired herself in the bathroom mirror, Tiana felt a sense of confidence she hadn't experienced in a while. School wasn't always easy, especially in a predominantly white district where she was often one of the few black students in her grade. The stares and whispers that followed her in the hallways, the teachers who could never seem to remember her name, the subtle and not so subtle comments, it all weighed on her. But today she felt shielded against that, wrapped in the strength of her braids and the love her mother had poured into each twist. Her mother had smiled proudly after they finished, running her fingers through Tiana's braids as if blessing them with her love and protection. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," her mother had said. "Wear your crown proudly." Now, as she grabbed her backpack and headed out the door, her mother's words echoed in her ears, giving her a boost of confidence as she prepared to face the school day. Her father dropped her off at Lincoln High, their small town's only high school. As she walked toward the school entrance, she felt the familiar tension settle into her shoulders, a protective armor she had learned to wear each day. Tiana kept her head high, knowing some kids might stare or comment about her hair, but she had learned to ignore the noise. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small today. The first few periods passed without incident. Her friends, mostly a diverse group of students who bonded over shared experiences, loved her braids. They showered her with compliments, each one making her smile a little wider, her confidence growing stronger. She thought that maybe today would be different. She would get through her classes, handle her assignments, and go home without any drama. But deep down there was an unsettled feeling she couldn't quite shake, as if a storm was quietly brewing, waiting to unleash itself. That storm arrived during fourth period, in Mrs. Jenkins' English class. Mrs. Jenkins was notorious among students, especially students of color, for her harsh treatment and uncompromising views on appearance and professionalism. Tiana had seen how Mrs. Jenkins would pick apart the smallest details about a student's appearance, disguising her harsh comments as advice for fitting in or tips for looking more presentable. Tiana had learned to keep her head down in her class, carefully following all the rules to avoid drawing Mrs. Jenkins' attention. But today her hair was bound to be noticed. The moment Tiana walked into the classroom, she felt Mrs. Jenkins' gaze latch onto her. It was an intense, probing look, the kind that made Tiana want to shrink into herself. She could feel Mrs. Jenkins scanning her braids, as if evaluating them, judging them, searching for something to criticize. Tiana quickly took her seat, hoping that if she avoided eye contact, Mrs. Jenkins would move on. But Mrs. Jenkins wasn't one to let things slide. As she began the day's lesson on Shakespeare, her voice crisp and precise, she seemed to go out of her way to glance at Tiana every few sentences. Tiana sat stiffly, her gaze fixed on her notebook, trying to focus on taking notes and ignore the burning sensation of her teacher's disapproving eyes. The other students noticed too. A few of them exchanged glances, sensing the tension. Some whispered, casting quick looks at Tiana's braids, wondering what Mrs. Jenkins would say. Finally, as the class worked on an assignment, Mrs. Jenkins made her way toward Tiana's desk. Tiana's heart began to race. She knew this wasn't going to be good. "Miss Washington," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice soft but cold, dripping with a polite disdain that was all too familiar to Tiana. "Can I see you at the front of the room, please?" The room went silent, all eyes turning to watch. Tiana's stomach dropped, but she stood up slowly, clutching her notebook, as if it could somehow protect her. She walked to the front of the classroom, feeling every pair of eyes on her, the whispers growing louder. When she reached Mrs. Jenkins, she kept her head down, staring at the floor. Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms, a look of disapproval painted across her face. She raised an eyebrow and gestured toward Tiana's braids. "Tiana, I'm concerned about your hairstyle today." Tiana's heart pounded as she glanced up, meeting Mrs. Jenkins' eyes. "Is there something wrong with it, Mrs. Jenkins?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Jenkins' lips curled into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, I've always emphasized the importance of maintaining a professional appearance. This hairstyle," she said, pausing for effect as she gestured at Tiana's braids, "is distracting. It doesn't reflect the decorum we expect in this classroom." Tiana's cheeks flushed. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, the weight of their silence pressing down on her. She tried to think of something to say, to defend herself, but the words were trapped in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had worked so hard on her braids, proud of her heritage and her expression. And now her teacher was standing here, treating her culture as if it were a disruption, an inconvenience. Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice colder now. "This school has standards, Tiana, and I'm afraid this hairstyle is not in line with those standards. I'm going to have to ask you to remove it." Tiana felt a surge of anger rise up inside her. She knew this was wrong, that Mrs. Jenkins had no right to ask her to change her hair. But she also knew the consequences of standing up for herself, the way students who spoke out were labeled as troublemakers. Her voice shook as she tried to find the words. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is my hair. I can't just..." Mrs. Jenkins cut her off, her expression hardening. "You can and you will. If you're not willing to comply, I'll have to address this with the principal, and you may face disciplinary action. Is that clear?" Tiana's vision blurred with tears, her pride and confidence from this morning now shattered. She couldn't believe she was being forced to choose between her identity and her education. She opened her mouth to protest again, but the weight of Mrs. Jenkins' gaze, cold and unyielding, silenced her. "Now," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice as sharp as a knife. She reached out with a pair of scissors she seemed to have produced from nowhere. And before Tiana could react, Mrs. Jenkins snipped off one of the golden beads at the end of a braid. Tiana gasped, her hand flying to her hair, but it was too late. The bead clattered onto the floor, a metallic echo that rang through the silent room. Tiana's classmates watched, some of them horrified, others too stunned to move. Her hands shook as she clutched her remaining braids, trying to hold on to what was left, trying to protect the pieces of herself that Mrs. Jenkins had stripped away. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but Tiana barely noticed. She stood frozen, staring at the bead on the floor, the sound of her teacher's voice still ringing in her ears. The pride she had felt that morning, the connection to her culture, was now buried under a wave of shame and helplessness. In that moment, Tiana vowed that she wouldn't let this go. Her voice might be small now, but she would find a way to make it heard. She would not let Mrs. Jenkins erase her identity without a fight. Tiana stumbled out of Mrs. Jenkins' classroom, her hands trembling as they clutched her backpack straps. She felt like her world was spinning, the humiliation heavy in her chest, suffocating her with every step. The usual bustling sounds of the hallway seemed muted, as though her shame had absorbed the noise around her, creating an isolating bubble she couldn't escape. She headed toward the nearest restroom, hoping she could get there before anyone saw her. Her vision blurred, her eyes stinging with unshed tears that she fought to hold back. She didn't want to cry here, not in this school where she was already made to feel out of place. But the pain was too raw, too heavy to push down. As soon as she entered the bathroom, Tiana dropped her backpack onto the floor, gripping the edges of the sink as she stared at herself in the mirror. The reflection that stared back was a ghostly version of the confident girl who had walked into school that morning, proud and ready to take on the day. Now, she saw only hurt, betrayal, and the raw wound that Mrs. Jenkins had opened with that single, humiliating snip. She looked at the ends of her braids, where the golden bead had once hung, now lying somewhere on the floor of Mrs. Jenkins' classroom like discarded trash. Her fingers traced the frayed end of the braid, her mind replaying the moment over and over. She could still feel Mrs. Jenkins' cold hands, still hear the sharp snip of the scissors that had stolen a piece of her. Her heart ached, her mind filled with questions she couldn't answer. Why would her teacher do this? What had she done to deserve this kind of humiliation? Did Mrs. Jenkins really think her braids were a distraction? Or was it something more, something deeper, uglier? Something Tiana was painfully familiar with, but had never experienced so blatantly in front of her classmates. As she stared at her reflection, the first tear slipped down her cheek. She hated that it came so easily, that her anger was mixed with a deep sadness that made her feel helpless. The betrayal ran deeper than she could express, a feeling of being stripped of her identity in a way that was as painful as it was shocking. The door opened behind her, and Tiana quickly wiped her tears, hoping to hide her anguish. But it was too late. Her friend Maya had already seen her. Maya, who was one of the few people Tiana trusted in this school, was staring at her with wide eyes, her expression quickly shifting to one of concern as she took in Tiana's tear-streaked face. "Tiana, what happened?" Maya asked, her voice soft but urgent as she moved closer. She placed a comforting hand on Tiana's shoulder, her touch grounding, reminding Tiana that she wasn't alone in this. For a moment, Tiana couldn't find the words. Her throat tightened, and she could only manage a shaky breath. But the concern in Maya's eyes encouraged her, and she found herself telling Maya everything, from the way Mrs. Jenkins had humiliated her in front of the class to the devastating moment when her teacher had cut the braid. As she spoke, Maya's face twisted with anger and disbelief. "Are you serious?" she exclaimed, her voice rising as she processed what Tiana had endured. "She really cut your hair? In front of everyone?" Tiana nodded, fresh tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't understand, Maya. I was just wearing my braids. It's not like I was doing anything wrong." Maya shook her head, anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. "That's not okay, Tiana. She can't just do that to you. You didn't do anything wrong. She's the one who's out of line." But even as Maya spoke, Tiana felt the doubts creeping in, the questions she couldn't silence. "What if she's right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if my hair really is distracting?" Maya's eyes blazed. "Don't you dare think that, Tiana. Your hair's beautiful. You're beautiful. She's the one with the problem, not you." Maya's fierce tone, her unwavering support, was like a balm to Tiana's wounded spirit. But the scars from Mrs. Jenkins' actions still felt raw, too fresh to fully heal with words alone. Maya pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. "You know what she said," her voice determined. "We're not going to let her get away with this. People need to know what she did." Tiana's eyes widened in alarm. "Maya, I don't know. My parents, they don't know yet, and I don't want this to turn into something big until I talk to them." Maya hesitated, concern flashing across her face. "But Tiana, she publicly humiliated you. This isn't just about you anymore. She crossed the line. She disrespected your identity, your heritage. People should know what kind of person she is." Tiana looked down, torn between the urge to stand up for herself and the fear of causing a scene that might make things worse. She knew Maya was right. She felt it in her bones. But the fear of retaliation, of being labeled a troublemaker, of making her life at school even harder, weighed heavily on her. After a few moments, she took a deep breath. "Let me talk to my parents first," she said, her voice firm. "They need to hear this from me." Maya nodded, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "All right, but promise me you'll let them help. You don't have to face this alone." Tiana managed a small smile, grateful for her friend's loyalty. "I promise." The school day dragged on after that, each period blurring into the next as Tiana moved through her classes on autopilot, her mind replaying the incident over and over. Her classmates' whispers followed her down the halls, and each glance, each sideways look, felt like another weight pressing down on her shoulders. She could sense the curiosity, the pity, and even some judgment from students who didn't understand what had really happened. By the time the final bell rang, Tiana felt utterly drained. She waited until the halls had mostly emptied before heading to her locker to grab her things. She wanted to avoid as many people as possible, hoping she could make it to her dad's car without any more questioning looks or whispers. But as she turned the corner, she spotted Mrs. Jenkins talking to another teacher near the faculty lounge. Tiana's heart raced, her fists clenching involuntarily as she caught sight of the woman who had so callously disrespected her. For a moment, she considered walking up to her, confronting her, demanding an explanation. But the thought was quickly replaced by a surge of anxiety. She wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Outside, Tiana's father was waiting by the curb, his familiar, reassuring presence immediately easing some of the tension that had been building inside her all day. She climbed into the car, her movements stiff, and buckled her seatbelt, trying to keep her face turned away to hide her lingering distress. Her father, always attuned to her emotions, glanced at her with concern. "Hey Tiana, everything all right?" he asked gently. Tiana's throat tightened. She had wanted to wait until they got home to tell her parents, but now that she was here, with her father's warm gaze on her, the words bubbled up, refusing to be contained any longer. "Dad," she started, her voice barely a whisper. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself, and then, slowly, she told him everything. She described how Mrs. Jenkins had singled her out, the way her words had stung, and finally the horrible moment when she'd felt the sharp snip of the scissors cutting away a part of her. Her father listened in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as his face darkened with anger. By the time Tiana had finished, his jaw was clenched, and his eyes were filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow that made her heart ache. She did what he asked, his voice low, trembling with barely restrained fury. Tiana nodded, her own voice too choked with emotion to respond. Without another word, her father pulled out his phone, dialing her mother, who picked up on the first ring. As he relayed the story, Tiana could hear her mother's shocked exclamations through the speaker. When he finished, her mother's voice softened, but there was a steely edge in her tone. "We're going to the school," her mother said firmly. "They need to know that this won't be swept under the rug." Tiana's father turned to her, his expression fierce but loving. "We're here for you, Tiana. We're going to make sure this teacher answers for what she did." And in that moment, as they drove home together, Tiana felt the first flicker of hope. The hurt was still there, deep and raw, but now it was tempered by a growing strength, a determination to stand up for herself and to face whatever came next. Her parents' support was like a shield, and though the road ahead might be difficult, she knew she wouldn't be walking it alone. Tiana spent the night tossing and turning, her mind racing as the events of the day replayed over and over. Her father's voice, low and angry as he spoke with her mother, drifted up through the floorboards late into the night, a steady reminder of the anger her parents felt on her behalf. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see Mrs. Jenkins' cold stare and the sharp glint of the scissors as they sliced through her braid. That sound, the snip that had echoed in the silent classroom, seemed etched into her memory, a cruel reminder of the humiliation she had endured. Her parents had decided they would confront the school administration first thing in the morning. Tiana's father had assured her that they wouldn't let Mrs. Jenkins' actions go unchallenged. "No one has the right to treat you that way, Tiana. Not her, not anyone," he'd said, his voice a mixture of reassurance and barely suppressed fury. For the first time since the incident, Tiana had felt a flicker of comfort, knowing her parents were ready to stand by her. When the morning arrived, Tiana dressed slowly, her usual morning routine tainted by the unease that still weighed on her. She tied her remaining braids back, feeling a pang of sadness as she touched the spot where the missing braid had once hung. It was a physical void that seemed to deepen the emotional wound Mrs. Jenkins had left behind. Her mother caught her lingering in front of the mirror, her expression softening as she approached. "You're strong, Tiana," her mother said gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What she did to you was wrong, and we're going to make sure she's held accountable." The three of them drove to the school in silence, the atmosphere tense. As they approached the administrative building, Tiana's father's jaw was set, his eyes steely with determination. Her mother reached over to squeeze his hand, a silent signal that they were in this together. Inside the school office, they were directed to the principal's office by a secretary who glanced at Tiana with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. News of the incident had already spread through the school, and the tension in the air was palpable. Tiana felt her cheeks flush under the weight of the secretary's gaze, the memory of the public humiliation she had endured still fresh. The principal, Mr. Sanders, was waiting for them, his expression somber as he gestured for them to sit down. Tiana could feel the weight of her parents' presence on either side of her, a steady force that grounded her even as her heart raced with anxiety. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington," Mr. Sanders began, his tone formal but uneasy. "I understand there was an incident in Mrs. Jenkins' class yesterday involving Tiana." Tiana's father leaned forward, his voice hard. "An incident? Mr. Sanders, what happened yesterday was more than an incident. My daughter was humiliated and degraded in front of her peers by a teacher who decided to take it upon herself to police my child's appearance." Mr. Sanders nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Washington. This is a serious matter, and we are conducting an internal review of the situation. Mrs. Jenkins, she has her own perspective on what happened." Perspective, Tiana's mother cut in, her voice cold. "What possible perspective could she have that justifies cutting my daughter's hair in front of her classmates?" Mr. Sanders cleared his throat, glancing down at his notes as if searching for the right words. "Mrs. Jenkins, felt that Tiana's hairstyle was a distraction in the classroom. She's very particular about her classroom environment, and she believed that taking action was necessary to maintain order. Tiana's father's fists clenched. Necessary? You're telling me that my daughter's hair are part of her identity, her culture is somehow a distraction, and that it's necessary to humiliate her to maintain order. Mr. Sanders shifted uncomfortably, looking genuinely distressed now. Please understand, I am not defending her actions. I'm simply explaining her position. We have already spoken to her, and she has been informed that her methods were inappropriate. Tiana couldn't believe what she was hearing. Inappropriate, she echoed, her voice shaking. She didn't just embarrass me. She made me feel like I don't belong here. Like there's something wrong with me just because of how I look. Her parents both turned to her, their faces softening as they listened to her speak. Her father placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, giving her the courage to continue. You talk about maintaining order, she said, looking directly at Mr. Sanders. But whose order? I follow the dress code. I don't cause trouble. I come here to learn, just like everyone else. Why does my hair, my identity, have to be erased to fit into her idea of what's acceptable? Mr. Sanders looked down, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. He took a deep breath before responding, his voice softer now. Tiana, I'm sorry that you've been made to feel this way. The last thing we want is for any student to feel unwelcome or disrespected in our school. We are looking into this matter seriously, and I can assure you that Mrs. Jenkins will face consequences. Tiana's father leaned forward, his gaze piercing. What kind of consequences? Mr. Sanders hesitated, clearly reluctant to give specifics. At this point, it's under investigation, and I cannot disclose any specific actions we're considering until the review is complete. However, I assure you that we will take the appropriate steps. The tension in the room grew thick, her parents' frustration simmering just below the surface. Tiana could feel the anger building in her own chest, a helpless rage at the thought that her pain might be swept under the rug, dismissed as a misunderstanding or an unfortunate incident. Her mother's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. Mr. Sanders, our daughter deserves more than vague assurances. We want to know that real action will be taken. What happened to her was not just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem of bias and discrimination. Mrs. Jenkins targeted Tiana because of her hair, because of her culture. If that isn't addressed, what's stopping it from happening to other students? Mr. Sanders nodded slowly, the weight of their words pressing down on him. I understand. We're implementing sensitivity training for our staff, and we're working on revising our dress code policies to ensure they are inclusive and respectful of all cultures and identities. This is a wake-up call. And I apologize on behalf of the school for the pain this has caused your family. Tiana's father's gaze didn't soften. That's a start, Mr. Sanders, but it's not enough. We want to be kept informed of every step in this process, and we expect Mrs. Jenkins to apologize directly to Tiana. Mr. Sanders winced slightly. I can speak with her about that. I'll encourage her to offer an apology, but I can't force her to do so. However, I'll make it clear that it would be in her best interest to make amends. Tiana's father exhaled sharply, clearly dissatisfied but realizing that they had gotten as much commitment as they were likely to receive today. He nodded slowly, exchanging a glance with Tiana's mother, who took Tiana's hand in her own and squeezed it gently. Mr. Sanders stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Please know that we are committed to making this right. If there's anything further I can do, don't hesitate to reach out. Tiana's father gave a curt nod. We'll hold you to that, Mr. Sanders. As they left the office, Tiana felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. Part of her was relieved that her parents had stood up for her, that the school had been forced to confront what had happened. But another part of her felt a lingering disappointment, a sense of helplessness that the apologies and reassurances couldn't fully erase. Her hair was still gone, her sense of belonging fractured. In the hallway, Tiana's mother pulled her into a tight hug. We're proud of you, she whispered, her voice filled with love and warmth. You showed so much strength today, Tiana. Tiana managed a small smile, feeling the strength of her parents' love surround her. But the wound still felt fresh, the sense of betrayal lingering beneath the surface. As they walked toward the exit, Tiana noticed a few students watching from a distance, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. She held her head high, refusing to let their stares diminish her. She had faced down her principal, and soon she would confront Mrs. Jenkins. She wasn't sure how she would find the strength, but she knew one thing: she would not be silenced. When Tiana and her parents returned home that afternoon, they found the neighborhood buzzing. Word of what had happened with Mrs. Jenkins had already spread, and the impact was far greater than any of them had anticipated. As they pulled into the driveway, Tiana spotted their neighbors, the Harris family, standing outside. Mrs. Harris waved, her face a mix of anger and concern as she walked over to greet them. "Tiana, are you all right, sweetheart?" Mrs. Harris asked, her voice soft but brimming with sympathy. "I just heard. I can't believe what that teacher did to you. It's absolutely outrageous." Tiana nodded, feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment and gratitude as Mrs. Harris reached out, pulling her into a gentle hug. Her words stirred something inside Tiana, a feeling that maybe her story, her voice, was stronger than she believed. Seeing the outrage on Mrs. Harris's face was comforting, a reminder that what happened was not something she had to face alone. The injustice she felt was shared by others around her. Mrs. Harris turned to Tiana's parents, her expression fierce. "I've already spoken with a few other parents and we're planning to bring this to the school board. We can't let this go unanswered. If we don't stand up now, what's to stop them from doing the same to another child?" Tiana's mother's face softened as she exchanged a look with Mrs. Harris. "Thank you, Carla. It means so much to know that we have your support. Tiana deserves to feel safe and respected at school, just like every other student. This has gone beyond just a simple issue with a teacher. It's a matter of respect for who she is." Mrs. Harris nodded firmly. "Absolutely. And we're going to make sure the school knows that the whole community is watching. This isn't just about one teacher or one incident. This is about making sure our kids don't have to hide who they are or feel ashamed of where they come from." The conversation seemed to be giving Tiana's parents renewed strength. Her father's face, which had been a mask of anger and frustration earlier, softened as he took her hand. He looked at her with pride, as if to say, "We're going to get through this, together." As they spoke, other neighbors began gathering, a few of them holding their phones and recording bits of the conversation to share on social media. Tiana's story was already spreading, and her friends and community members were quick to rally around her. People were outraged, their anger ignited by the thought of a teacher targeting a student in such a humiliating and degrading way. Soon, comments and messages of support poured in online, with hashtags like Justice for Tiana and Stand with Tiana starting to trend locally. Photos of Tiana, proudly wearing her braids, began circulating as people voiced their outrage and shared personal stories of discrimination. Tiana's mother looked at her daughter, pride shining in her eyes. "Your voice is stronger than you think, Tiana. People are listening because you spoke up." The surge of support felt surreal to Tiana. She had never imagined that the incident would resonate with so many people, that her pain and frustration would echo beyond the walls of her school. But as she scrolled through the comments and messages on her phone, she saw that her story was touching people in ways she hadn't expected. Some shared their own experiences of feeling marginalized or silenced, while others simply offered words of encouragement, assuring her that she was not alone. Among the messages was one from her friend Maya, who had been a pillar of strength throughout the ordeal. Maya's message was simple but powerful: "You're a warrior, Tiana. Don't let anyone take that from you." As the evening progressed, the support from the community only grew stronger. By the time night fell, Tiana's family home had become a gathering spot for neighbors who wanted to show their solidarity. Parents, students, and local activists all stood together on the lawn, holding signs and candles as a symbol of their unity. The gathering was peaceful, but there was an undeniable energy in the air, a sense of purpose that bound them together. It was as if they were all part of a movement that extended beyond Tiana's story, a movement for respect, for inclusion, for the right to be unapologetically oneself. Local news crews arrived, cameras flashing as they interviewed Tiana and her family. The reporters asked her how she felt, what she wanted the school to do, and what message she hoped to send. Tiana's hands trembled as she held the microphone, but she looked into the camera with a steady gaze, drawing strength from the people around her. "I want people to know that who you are should never be something you have to apologize for," she said, her voice clear but emotional. "We're all different. We come from different backgrounds, we have different experiences, and that's what makes us special. No one should ever have to feel like they don't belong because of that." Her words resonated, and the crowd applauded, their voices rising in unity. Tiana's parents stood beside her, their hands on her shoulders, showing their unwavering support. For the first time since the incident, Tiana felt a surge of pride, a sense that she was reclaiming her voice, her identity, and her right to be herself. The police chief, Mark Reynolds, arrived as the crowd began to quiet down. A tall, steady figure with a calm but authoritative presence, he was known for his fairness and commitment to justice. Chief Reynolds approached Tiana's family with a respectful nod, his expression one of empathy. "Tiana," he said, his voice warm, "I'm truly sorry for what happened to you. No one should have to go through what you did. I want you to know that we're looking into this, and we're committed to making sure everyone feels safe and respected in our community." Tiana nodded, grateful for his presence. She had heard stories about Chief Reynolds and knew that he had always been supportive of the community, especially when it came to standing against discrimination. His words gave her a sense of hope that real change might be possible. "As a father myself," Chief Reynolds continued, "I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you and your family. But I want you to know that you have our full support, and we'll work together to make sure that your voice is heard." The crowd murmured in approval, the sense of unity growing stronger with every word. People began to chant, their voices rising in harmony, "Justice for Tiana! Justice for Tiana!" The chant grew louder, filling the night with a powerful energy that seemed to vibrate through the air. Tiana felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of pride and gratitude as she looked at the faces around her. These were people who cared, people who were willing to stand by her side, to fight for her right to be seen and respected. It was a feeling she would never forget, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were those who would stand with her. As the crowd eventually dispersed, Tiana and her family returned to their home, feeling a new sense of purpose and hope. The world outside had seemed cold and unkind just a day ago, but now, surrounded by the love and support of their community, it felt like a place where change was possible, where Tiana's voice could make a difference. Before heading to bed, Tiana took a moment to sit by her window, looking out at the quiet street. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a release of the anger and shame that had clouded her heart since the incident. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she knew she wasn't facing them alone. The love of her family, the strength of her community, and the unwavering support of her friends would be her armor. She closed her eyes, her mind filled with the faces of everyone who had come to stand by her, who had reminded her that she was more than the pain Mrs. Jenkins had tried to inflict. She was strong, and most importantly, she was unbreakable. The days following the community gathering were filled with a sense of anticipation and tension. Tiana's story had spread far beyond their small town, with people across the state now following the case closely. News articles, social media posts, and even local podcasts began discussing Tiana's experience and what it meant for the broader issue of racial discrimination in schools. The pressure mounted on the school board to take decisive action, and Mrs. Jenkins' name had become synonymous with the painful issue of racial bias in the educational system. One morning, Tiana's family received a call from the school board's office, requesting their attendance at an official hearing scheduled for the following week. The board had decided to conduct a formal investigation into Mrs. Jenkins' actions, and Tiana and her parents were invited to testify. The news brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. Finally, Tiana would have the chance to speak her truth in a formal setting, but the thought of reliving the incident in front of an audience was daunting. In the days leading up to the hearing, Tiana's parents prepared her, reviewing what she might say and how to handle difficult questions. They encouraged her to stay calm, to speak from her heart, and to remember that she wasn't just speaking for herself, but for every student who had ever been made to feel ashamed of who they were. The day of the hearing arrived, and Tiana found herself sitting in a conference room filled with people from the community, reporters, and members of the school board. The room buzzed with a tense energy, everyone aware of the gravity of the situation. Tiana sat between her mother and father, feeling the comforting warmth of their presence beside her. At the front of the room, the school board members sat behind a long table, their expressions somber as they prepared for the session. Mrs. Jenkins was seated at another table across the room, her face impassive, though there was a subtle tension in her posture. She avoided looking at Tiana, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, but Tiana could feel the weight of her presence, a reminder of the pain and humiliation she had endured. The chair of the school board, Ms. Roberts, opened the hearing with a brief statement, acknowledging the importance of the issue and their commitment to creating a respectful and inclusive environment for all students. She then invited Tiana to speak, her voice calm but encouraging as she gestured for Tiana to come forward. With a deep breath, Tiana rose from her seat, feeling the eyes of the room follow her as she walked to the front. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the podium, but she steadied herself, drawing strength from her parents' supportive gazes. Tiana Ms. Roberts said, her tone gentle, "We want you to feel comfortable sharing your experience here today. Please take your time and tell us, in your own words, what happened in Mrs. Jenkins' class." Tiana nodded, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. She began by describing that morning how she had arrived at school feeling proud of her new braids, how they represented her culture, her family, and her heritage. Her voice softened as she explained how much it had meant to her to wear her braids, a simple expression of herself that she never expected would become a source of conflict. As she recounted the incident, Tiana's voice grew stronger, fueled by the memory of the humiliation and anger that had burned within her that day. She described Mrs. Jenkins' harsh words, her demand that Tiana conform to a standard that seemed to target only students like her. The room was silent, her words filling the air with a weight that was almost tangible. And then Tiana's voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "She took out a pair of scissors and cut my hair, right in front of everyone. She didn't even ask if it was okay, she just did it, as if my hair, my identity, didn't matter. I felt small, like I was being told that who I am, where I come from, isn't welcome in this school." Her words hung in the air, a raw, painful truth that left many in the room visibly moved. Ms. Roberts nodded, her eyes softening with empathy as she took in Tiana's testimony. She glanced over at the other board members, then turned her gaze to Mrs. Jenkins, who sat silently, her expression unreadable. After Tiana finished speaking, Ms. Roberts opened the floor to questions from the board. One of the members, Mr. Langston, an older man with silver hair and a gentle demeanor, leaned forward, his voice thoughtful as he addressed her. "Tiana," he said, "thank you for your bravery in sharing this with us. I know this can't be easy. You mentioned that this wasn't the first time you felt singled out by Mrs. Jenkins. Could you tell us a bit more about that?" Tiana nodded, her heart pounding as she remembered the other moments, the smaller but no less painful incidents that had marked her experience in Mrs. Jenkins' class. She described how Mrs. Jenkins had often made comments about her appearance, subtle but loaded statements about professionalism. And fitting in, she recalled the way Mrs. Jenkins would scrutinize her and her friends more closely, the way her gaze would linger, as if searching for a reason to reprimand them. "It wasn't just one day," Tiana said, her voice quiet but resolute. "It was like, she had a problem with me, with students like me. She never said it outright, but I could feel it in the way she looked at us, the way she treated us differently." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting a shared sense of unease. They turned to Mrs. Jenkins, who had remained silent throughout Tiana's testimony, her face tense as she listened. Ms. Roberts addressed Mrs. Jenkins directly. "Mrs. Jenkins, would you like to respond?" Mrs. Jenkins finally looked up, her face a mask of forced composure. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but defensive as she spoke. "I appreciate the chance to address this," she began, her gaze shifting uncomfortably as she addressed the board. "I have always believed in maintaining a professional and focused environment in my classroom. It's my responsibility to ensure that my students are prepared for the real world, where appearance and behavior are often scrutinized." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "When I addressed Tiana's hairstyle, it was not meant to be an attack on her or her culture. I was simply trying to uphold the standards I believe are necessary for success." The room stirred with quiet murmurs, many of the attendees exchanging looks of disbelief. Tiana felt a surge of anger rise within her. How could Mrs. Jenkins continue to defend her actions, framing them as a form of professionalism when they had been so clearly rooted in prejudice? Ms. Roberts raised a hand to quiet the room, her gaze sharp as she addressed Mrs. Jenkins. "Mrs. Jenkins, I understand the importance of maintaining a respectful classroom environment, but do you not see how your actions could be perceived as discriminatory? By singling out Tiana's hairstyle, you weren't simply enforcing standards, you were targeting a cultural expression that is significant to her identity." Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her confidence wavering as Ms. Roberts' words struck a nerve. She glanced around the room, the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on her. I understand how it could be interpreted that way, she said, her voice tight. But that was never my intention. I simply wanted to ensure that all students were focused on their studies without distractions. Ms. Roberts nodded, though her expression remained stern. Thank you for your response, Mrs. Jenkins. However, it's clear from Tiana's testimony, as well as the accounts of her classmates, that this incident has caused significant harm. We will be making a decision on the necessary disciplinary actions. And I would strongly advise you to consider the impact of your actions moving forward. The hearing concluded, and Tiana returned to her seat, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over her. She had spoken her truth, and though she didn't know what the outcome would be, she felt a sense of closure, as if she had taken a step toward reclaiming the part of herself that Mrs. Jenkins had tried to diminish. As the board deliberated, Tiana's parents held her hands, their faces filled with pride and love. They had stood by her through every step of this ordeal, and now, whatever the outcome, she knew that she was not alone in this fight. When the board finally announced their decision, it was clear Mrs. Jenkins would be placed on administrative leave, and the school would implement new diversity training programs for faculty and staff. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step toward change, a step that Tiana had helped set into motion. As they left the hearing, Tiana looked out at the faces of her community, the people who had supported her, and felt a sense of triumph. She had faced her fear, stood up against injustice, and in doing so, had shown herself and everyone else that her voice mattered. The days after Mrs. Jenkins was placed on administrative leave were filled with both hope and rising tension. The news of her suspension had spread quickly through town, drawing a mix of reactions. Some parents were outraged at the school board's decision, claiming that Mrs. Jenkins was a dedicated teacher who had merely been enforcing standards. They argued that she was being unfairly punished for maintaining order. But for others, especially the families and students who had seen or experienced discrimination firsthand, her suspension was a sign that change was finally possible. Tiana felt the shift most acutely at school. The hallways seemed charged with whispers, glances, and murmurs that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Some students supported her openly, expressing their solidarity and pride that she had stood up for herself and for everyone who had felt marginalized by Mrs. Jenkins. They wore pins and carried signs that read, "Justice for Tiana and our hair, our identity," showing their support in a powerful, visible way. But there were also those who sneered, rolling their eyes or making snide comments under their breath. One day, as she walked to her locker between classes, she overheard a group of students murmuring nearby. "All this over some braids," one of them scoffed. "It's just hair. I don't get why it's such a big deal." Tiana's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high, reminding herself that their ignorance didn't define her or the significance of her fight. She had come too far, had endured too much, to let those who didn't understand her struggle silence her. Besides, she wasn't alone. Maya and her other friends had rallied around her, walking beside her in the hallways, standing with her in the cafeteria, and showing her through their actions that they would be by her side no matter what. But the tension at school was nothing compared to the uproar outside. Over the weekend, the community had organized a protest outside the school. Parents, students, teachers, and even activists from nearby towns gathered, holding signs and chanting for justice. Their voices were loud, resolute, demanding more than just a temporary leave for Mrs. Jenkins. They wanted assurances that the school would take meaningful steps to prevent discrimination and create a safer, more inclusive environment for all students. Tiana and her family attended the protest, joining the growing crowd that had gathered on the school's front lawn. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of anger, hope, and determination. Tiana held a sign that read, "Our culture, our rights," her voice blending with the chorus of others as they chanted together. Standing among so many people who believed in the same cause, she felt a powerful surge of unity and pride, a reminder that her voice had sparked something much bigger than herself. As the protest continued, local news reporters arrived, capturing footage of the crowd and interviewing participants. Tiana's mother was one of the first to speak, her words clear and impassioned as she described the pain her daughter had endured and the changes they hoped to see. "This isn't just about one teacher or one incident," her mother said, her voice steady as she addressed the camera. "This is about ensuring that every student, regardless of their background, can feel safe, valued, and respected at school. Our children deserve to be celebrated for who they are, not punished for it." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in agreement as her mother stepped back, wrapping an arm around Tiana's shoulders. Tiana felt a surge of pride and gratitude, her mother's support filling her with a renewed sense of courage. The day wore on, and the protest only grew in size and intensity. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the crowd, the police chief, Mark Reynolds, arrived to address the protesters. He had been watching the developments closely and had supported Tiana's family throughout the ordeal, but his arrival brought a sense of official gravity to the protest. He stepped forward, holding up his hands to quiet the crowd. "I want to thank everyone for coming out today," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "As a community, it's important that we stand together against any form of discrimination. Our schools should be a place of learning, acceptance, and respect. We're committed to working with the school board to ensure that what happened to Tiana never happens again." The crowd erupted into applause, grateful for his words and his visible support. Chief Reynolds had long been a respected figure in the community, known for his commitment to justice and equality. His words carried weight, offering reassurance that they weren't just shouting into the void, that their voices were being heard by those with the power to make real changes. But as the crowd settled, a small group of counter-protesters appeared on the other side of the lawn, holding signs that read, "Support our teachers and education over politics." Their voices clashed with the protesters, their chants challenging the movement Tiana had helped ignite. Tiana's heart sank as she watched them, a mixture of anger and disbelief coursing through her. She had never imagined that there would be people who would defend what Mrs. Jenkins had done, who would reduce her pain to a matter of politics. It felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of the forces she was up against, the people who would refuse to see the harm caused by their words and actions. One of the counter-protesters, a middle-aged woman with a severe expression, shouted, "Our teachers have the right to maintain order in their classrooms. If these students would just follow the rules, none of this would be necessary." The woman's words sent a ripple of anger through the crowd, but Chief Reynolds held up a hand, urging calm. He turned to the counter-protesters, his voice firm but respectful as he addressed them. "Everyone here has a right to their opinion," he said, his tone steady. "But let's remember why we're here. This is about respect, about ensuring that every student is treated with dignity. There's a way to maintain order without demeaning or diminishing our students' identities." The counter-protesters fell silent, some of them shifting uncomfortably under the weight of his words. Tiana felt a surge of relief, grateful for Chief Reynolds' support. He had reminded them all that this wasn't about rules or authority, it was about humanity, about the right to exist unapologetically. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to disperse, the protesters and supporters alike feeling the impact of the day's events. Tiana's heart felt heavy but hopeful. She knew that this was only the beginning, that the fight for change was far from over. But as she walked back to her car with her parents, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and supporters, she felt a sense of pride and purpose that gave her the strength to keep moving forward. That night, Tiana sat by her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street, her mind filled with the events of the day. She thought about the voices she had heard, the stories people had shared, the support they had shown her. Her heart swelled with gratitude, a warmth that chased away the fear and pain that had weighed on her since the incident. But she also knew that change wouldn't come easily. There would be more challenges, more resistance from those who clung to outdated beliefs, who couldn't see the harm in their actions. She thought of Mrs. Jenkins, who had refused to apologize, who had defended her actions with a sense of entitlement that stung as much as the initial humiliation. Yet Tiana felt a glimmer of hope. She had seen the power of her community, had witnessed the strength of people who were willing to stand up for what was right. She wasn't just one voice, she was part of a movement, a force that was growing stronger with every word, every protest, every story shared. And she knew that as long as she had the support of her family, her friends, and her community, she could face whatever came next. Tomorrow she would return to school, where the whispers and glances would continue. But she would walk through those hallways with her head held high, her heart steady with the knowledge that she was fighting for something greater than herself. She was fighting for respect, for acceptance, for the right to be seen and celebrated as she was. With a deep breath, Tiana closed her eyes, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer afraid. The world might not change overnight, but she was ready to keep fighting, to keep speaking her truth until it did. And in that quiet moment, as the moon cast a gentle light over her room, Tiana knew that she would never be silenced again. The day of the official school board hearing arrived, and the atmosphere at Lincoln High was tense. For weeks, the community had waited for this moment, the culmination of protests, rallies, and countless conversations around the dinner table, in classrooms, and at the town hall. This hearing would determine whether Mrs. Jenkins would be permanently dismissed and what changes the school would implement to ensure a respectful and inclusive environment for all students. Tiana sat in the boardroom with her parents, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. The room was filled with people, teachers, students, parents, board members, and members of the community who had supported Tiana from the beginning. Some of them were familiar faces, people who had been with her at protests, offering hugs and words of encouragement. Others were faces she didn't recognize, but she could see the same look of support and expectation in their eyes. At the front of the room sat the school board members, their expressions serious as they shuffled through documents and notes. Tiana knew they had been under immense pressure, receiving letters, emails, and even phone calls from people demanding justice. She could see the weight of that responsibility etched into their faces as they prepared for the hearing to begin. Beside the board members sat Mrs. Jenkins, her face stoic as she gazed ahead, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. She wore a conservative suit, her posture stiff and her expression unreadable. Tiana could feel a mixture of emotions bubbling up within her as she looked at Mrs. Jenkins' anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. But she reminded herself why she was there, not to seek revenge, but to make sure that no one else would have to endure what she had. The school board chair, Ms. Roberts, tapped her gavel, signaling the beginning of the hearing. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her as she addressed the audience. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This hearing is a critical moment for our school and our community. We are here to address the incident involving Tiana Washington and Mrs. Jenkins. An incident that has brought important issues to light regarding the treatment of students and the need for respect and inclusivity in our educational environment. Today, we will listen to statements from both sides before making a final decision. She turned to Tiana with a small, encouraging smile. Tiana, you have the floor. Tiana took a deep breath, feeling her parents' supportive presence beside her. She rose from her seat, her legs trembling slightly as she walked to the podium. As she stood there, looking out over the faces of her classmates, teachers, and community members, she felt a surge of courage. This was her chance to speak not only for herself, but for everyone who had felt silenced, overlooked, or diminished. Thank you, Ms. Roberts, she began, her voice steady. I want to start by saying that I never wanted things to come to this point. I came to school that day, just like any other day, hoping to learn, to connect with my classmates, to be myself. But instead, I was made to feel like I didn't belong. Like there was something wrong with me because of how I looked, because of my hair, a part of me that represents my culture, my family, and my identity. Tiana paused, glancing down at her hands before looking up again, her gaze firm. Mrs. Jenkins singled me out. She told me that my hair was a distraction, that it didn't fit in her classroom. And when she cut my hair, it wasn't just a physical act, it was an attack on who I am. It made me feel small, ashamed, like I wasn't welcome here. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on, determined to finish. But I am not alone. Many of us, especially students of color, have felt this way at some point. We've had to shrink ourselves, to hide parts of who we are, just to fit in. I don't want anyone else to have to feel that way, not here, not anywhere. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Tiana could see tears in the eyes of some of her classmates, and her parents looked at her with pride, their expressions filled with love and admiration. Ms. Roberts nodded, her face thoughtful. Thank you, Tiana. Your words are powerful, and they remind us all of the importance of respect and inclusivity. Mrs. Jenkins, would you like to respond? Mrs. Jenkins stood, her expression guarded as she approached the podium. She took a moment, glancing around the room before speaking. First, I want to say that it was never my intention to make any student feel unwelcome or disrespected. I have always believed in maintaining a professional classroom environment, one that prepares students for the real world, where standards and expectations can be strict. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of defensiveness. When I addressed Tiana's hairstyle, it was in an effort to uphold those standards. I understand now that my approach may have been misguided. I regret that my actions have caused so much pain. Tiana felt a pang of frustration. Mrs. Jenkins' words were carefully chosen, but they lacked genuine remorse. There was no acknowledgement of the harm she had caused, no true understanding of why her actions had been so deeply hurtful. One of the board members, Mr. Langston, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Jenkins. "Mrs. Jenkins, can you see how your actions might be interpreted as discriminatory? By targeting Tiana's hairstyle, which is an expression of her culture, you were not simply enforcing a dress code. You were sending a message that her identity didn't belong in your classroom." Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her composure faltering for the first time. She glanced down, her hands clenching at the podium. "I understand that it may have been perceived that way," she replied, her tone softer. "But it was never my intention to discriminate." Ms. Roberts sighed, her expression a mixture of frustration and disappointment. "Mrs. Jenkins' intent is important, but so are impact and accountability. We are here to ensure that our students feel safe and respected, and it's clear that your actions did not uphold that standard." The hearing continued, with more students, parents, and community members sharing their experiences and perspectives. Many spoke passionately about the need for change, about the ways in which small acts of prejudice could accumulate, creating an environment where students felt they couldn't be themselves. They spoke of the pain of being made to feel invisible, of being told directly or indirectly that their identities didn't fit. One student, a quiet boy named Jamal, stood up to share his experience. "I've always felt like I had to change myself to be accepted," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've hidden parts of who I am, just so I wouldn't get singled out or called out by teachers. It's exhausting, and it makes me feel like I'm not enough." His words resonated with the room, the unspoken experiences of so many students brought to light in a way that was raw, vulnerable, and impossible to ignore. Tiana felt a surge of empathy, realizing that she was not alone in her struggle, that her experience was part of a much larger story. Finally, after hours of testimonies and discussions, the school board announced their decision. Ms. Roberts stood, her voice firm as she addressed the room. "After careful consideration, we have decided that Mrs. Jenkins will be permanently removed from her teaching position at Lincoln High. Furthermore, we will be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all faculty and staff, as well as revising our dress code policy to ensure that it is inclusive of all cultural expressions." The room erupted into applause, a wave of relief and triumph washing over the crowd. Tiana felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense of justice and closure that filled her with gratitude. Her parents hugged her tightly, their pride and love wrapping around her like a warm embrace. As they left the hearing, Tiana looked around at the faces of her classmates, her teachers, her community. She felt a surge of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things would be different now. The fight for respect, for dignity, for the right to be seen and celebrated as she was, it wasn't over, but she had taken a powerful step forward. And as she walked out of the building, her head held high, Tiana knew that this victory was only the beginning. The weeks following the school board's decision brought a new atmosphere to Lincoln High. There was an undeniable sense of transformation that seemed to breathe through the hallways, changing not only the way students interacted with each other but also how teachers approached their roles. The diversity and inclusion training sessions had already started, and although they were only the beginning of a long journey, the effects were evident. Teachers who had once enforced rigid standards with little thought to their impact were beginning to understand the importance of creating a space where students could be themselves without fear of judgment or discrimination. For Tiana, returning to school after the hearing was both a relief and a challenge. The incident with Mrs. Jenkins had left scars, invisible but deep, and some days were harder than others. But she could feel the weight of her community's support, the knowledge that so many people had stood beside her, believing in her right to be unapologetically herself. It was a powerful reminder that she wasn't alone. One morning, as she was walking down the hallway toward her English class, Tiana noticed several students gathered around a poster on the wall. Curious, she approached, seeing the bright letters at the top of the poster, "Celebrate Your Culture Day." Beneath it, a colorful banner announced that students were invited to wear traditional clothing, bring food from their cultures, and share pieces of their heritage with the school. Tiana's heart swelled as she realized that this was something new, an event created to honor the diversity of their school community. She glanced around at the faces of her classmates, some of whom looked excited, others a little uncertain, but most of them intrigued. It was a small but significant step toward the change she had hoped for, a reminder that her voice had sparked something meaningful. Maya spotted her from across the hallway and made her way over, her face lighting up as she saw Tiana's expression. "Did you see?" Maya asked, a grin spreading across her face. "They actually listened. Can you believe it?" Tiana nodded, still taking it all in. "I never thought. I hoped, but I didn't think it would happen so soon." Maya nudged her playfully. "Well, believe it. You did this, Tiana. You stood up, and people listened." The two friends shared a quiet moment, each of them feeling the impact of what they had accomplished together. The challenges they had faced, the fear and the frustration, now felt like stepping stones leading them to a brighter, more inclusive future. And in that moment, Tiana felt a surge of pride, not only in herself but in her friends, her family, and everyone who had believed in her. That evening, Tiana's family gathered to celebrate. Her grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the house, each of them bringing food, laughter, and stories to share. Her grandmother, who had always been a source of strength and wisdom, pulled Tiana aside, her eyes twinkling as she held her granddaughter's hands. "You know, Tiana," her grandmother said, her voice soft but full of conviction, "you've done something truly brave. You've taken on a fight that many people would have shied away from, but you faced it with grace and strength. I am so proud of you." Tiana's eyes welled up with tears, but she smiled, grateful for her grandmother's words. "I didn't think I was strong enough," she admitted. "There were so many times I wanted to give up." Her grandmother nodded, a gentle smile on her face. "That's what makes you strong, my dear. Strength isn't about not feeling afraid, it's about moving forward despite the fear. You've shown everyone what it means to stand up for what's right." Tiana hugged her grandmother tightly, the love and support of her family filling her heart with a warmth that eased the lingering pain from her experience. She had fought for justice, for respect, and for the right to be herself. And now, surrounded by the people who had supported her from the beginning, she felt whole. The next day at school, Tiana prepared for Celebrate Your Culture Day with a mixture of excitement and nerves. She wore a beautiful dress her mother had picked out, adorned with patterns and colors that reflected her heritage. Her hair was braided and decorated with beads, each one shining as she moved through the hallways with her friends. Students around her wore outfits from their own culture's kimonos, dashikis, saris, and many others, each one a testament to the rich diversity within their community. In her first class, the teacher invited everyone to share a little about their heritage and what it meant to them. Tiana felt her heart race as her turn approached, but she took a deep breath, drawing strength from the support she had received. "When I wear my braids, I feel connected to something bigger than myself," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's a reminder of my culture, my family, and all the people who came before me. I wear them with pride because they're a part of who I am." The class listened intently, some of them nodding, others smiling in understanding. Tiana felt a sense of unity, a realization that her struggle had brought them all closer together, each of them feeling a little freer to be themselves. Later that afternoon, the students gathered in the auditorium for a special assembly where some students shared poems, stories, and songs from their cultures. The energy in the room was vibrant, a celebration of individuality and community that filled Tiana's heart with joy. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace, surrounded by people who saw her, respected her, and celebrated her. As the assembly concluded, Ms. Roberts, the school board chair, took the stage. She looked out over the students, her expression warm and proud as she addressed the room. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today, for sharing pieces of yourselves with us, Ms. Roberts said, her voice ringing with sincerity. "This celebration is a reflection of our commitment to creating a space where everyone feels valued and respected. And I want to thank Tiana Washington for reminding us all of the importance of standing up for who we are and for what we believe in." The room erupted into applause, students and teachers alike showing their appreciation for Tiana's courage. She felt her face flush, a mixture of embarrassment and pride as she smiled at the people around her. Maya gave her a quick squeeze on the shoulder, and Tiana's heart swelled with gratitude for the friends who had stood by her through it all. As the students filed out of the auditorium, Tiana felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Chief Reynolds, the police chief who had supported her from the beginning, standing beside her with a proud smile. "Tiana, I just wanted to tell you how much I admire your strength," he said. "You've made a difference not just here, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. Thank you for standing up, for speaking out. You've inspired more people than you know." Tiana felt a lump form in her throat, but she managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, Chief Reynolds. I couldn't have done it without everyone's support." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, it takes courage to do what you did, and because of you, this school, this community, it's a better place. Don't ever forget that." As Tiana walked home that day, her heart felt light, her mind filled with memories of the journey that had brought her here. She thought of all the people who had been a part of her story, her family, who had given her strength, her friends, who had stood by her side, her community, who had rallied around her, and even Mrs. Jenkins, whose actions had sparked a fight for justice that Tiana never would have imagined herself waging. But most of all, she thought of herself, the girl who had faced her fears, who had spoken her truth even when it felt impossible. She had grown in ways she hadn't anticipated, discovering a resilience she hadn't known was there. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, still battles to fight, but she was ready for them. She had found her voice, and nothing, and no one could ever take it from her again. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a warm glow over her neighborhood, Tiana sat by her window, watching the world outside. She felt a sense of peace, a quiet but powerful belief in herself and in the change she had helped create. She whispered a quiet promise to herself, a vow to keep fighting, to keep believing, and to keep being unapologetically, fiercely herself. The journey wasn't over, but she was ready. And as she closed her eyes, a smile on her face, Tiana knew that this was just the beginning of a life lived in truth, courage, and pride.